everyone, and welcome to today's CID Speaker Series. I'm Nika Santos, a student ambassador at the Center for International Development and a student in the Education Leadership, Organizations, and Entrepreneurship (EDM) at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I look forward to today's discussion on the management of slums and urbanization, leveraging spatial data. The format for today's session is a 20 to 25-minute presentation from our speaker and around 20 minutes for Q&A. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First, during the question and answer session, you can submit your questions via the chat and our moderator will bring them into the space. We're also recording today's session. The video of this event will be available on the CID YouTube channel, so feel free to share it with your friends and other interested parties. And this is our final speaker series of the semester. So we hope you'll keep an eye out for CID's event newsletters for announcements about the next semester series. We will also add links in the chat to sign up for our newsletter and social media channels to hear more about research and events at CID. Without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator for today, Gordon Hanson. Gordon is a Peter Wertheim Professor in Urban Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He specializes in international trade, international migration, and economic geography. Thank you everyone for being here. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nika. It's really a pleasure to be with everybody this morning. And I'm delighted to introduce Nina Harari to present her work on slum upgrading in Jakarta and its broader implications for urban planning and urban development in emerging economies worldwide. Nina is one of the bright young stars to come along in urban economics with her work, much of her work concentrated on developing countries. She's produced a series of really influential and innovative papers that leverage the power of remote sensing, that is, new forms of measuring what's going on the ground via satellite imagery and other remotely sensed data sources that then give us the ability to understand what's happening at granular scale. So we are kind of very familiar with in the CID world, getting access to data in developing countries can be incredibly hard. And Nina has shown us a path for how we can access just incredible troves of data to ask questions of first order policy importance. I teach her papers in my urban economic policy class at the Kennedy School. And I'm delighted to be hosting today's event. Nina, I will turn things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your introduction and thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be sharing some of my research with you this morning. So just to, let me see if this works. Okay, so just to set the stage, I just want to point out a couple ways in which urbanization in developing countries is different from what developed countries experienced. And one feature is just the sheer scale. We're talking about a lot of people that we have to fit into cities. And the second feature is that urbanization is happening in an environment that has many different kinds of frictions. And some of these frictions have very prominent manifestations in the built environment. And an example is slums or informal settlements. I'll be kind of using the two words interchangeably. And a very common pattern in developing country cities is this juxtaposition of formal developments and slum next to each other that suggests there might be some kind of misallocation in land use that's happening. And if you look historically at what developed country cities experienced, they grew through different combinations of horizontal sprawl and vertical growth. And this process was mediated by land markets that reallocated land to the best use. But in a developing country settings, because there are all these different kinds of land market imperfections, this process is more complicated. And for policymakers, this comes with some very pressing questions. How do we fit in all these people? How do we accommodate urban growth? How are we going to reconfigure cities spatially to accommodate all this influx of new urban dwellers? And concretely, it's about how do we provide shelter for a lot of people? How do we raise our tax base to fund infrastructural investment? And this is kind of an overarching theme of my own research. And in some of my prior research on India, I found that the way in which cities end up being configured spatially, how much they grow by sprawling horizontally versus layering up vertically, ends up having important implications for productivity, for quality of life, and also for equality and upward mobility potentially. So these are important questions also because in cities, investments are very persistent. So the way in which we shape cities today will have important implications for cities tomorrow. Now, what is the role for research? Research needs to be able to inform policy with good causal designs and good data. And both can be tricky in the context of developing country cities. On the data side, one challenge is that large chunks of developing country cities are informal and therefore by definition not covered in official data sources. And causal designs in cities are also potentially more difficult than in other settings because there are a lot of general equilibrium implications, and a lot of policies implemented in cities have spatial components. They target particular kinds of areas, so there are endogeneity concerns associated with doing policy evaluation in cities. So some of the things that I'll emphasize in my talk today is how some novel data sources can be leveraged to inform policy in cities on some important issues, and in particular, I'm going to focus on slum policy. So slums are this prominent phenomenon in developing country cities. 1 billion people in the world are estimated to be in slums, and most developing country governments will say that one of their objectives is for their country to be slum-free. But slums are at the heart of a really politically charged debate on what to do with people living in slums. And this is a range of policy approaches that have been implemented in different countries. One approach is titling, providing property rights. Another approach is sites and services, which is about planning neighborhoods ex ante. Before the people come in, we lay out the public goods and we let people come in and self-build their housing. Public housing is another approach where basically you relocate slum residents into subsidized public housing that often ends up being in peripheral locations where land is cheap and governments can afford building public housing. And what I'm going to talk about today is slum upgrading, which is a policy approach that is very common. It has been implemented in many different countries, Indonesia, Brazil, India. It continues to be relevant for many countries today. And it's about providing local public goods on site in slums. So the idea is, instead of relocating the residents, let's keep the residents where they are. Let's preserve the slums, which host a lot of people, and let's improve them with physical upgrades. And I'm going to speak to slum upgrading, drawing upon one of the world's earliest and largest scale slum upgrading programs, the Kampung Improvement Program, or KIP, in Jakarta, Indonesia's capital city. And Kampung is the Indonesian word used to refer to informal settlements. So this was a large program in terms of coverage. 5 million beneficiaries and a quarter of Jakarta's land area were covered, and it's an old program. It started in 1969, went all the way to 1984. And the program consisted in pretty basic upgrades, like you see here in the photos. Footpaths were built and drainage canals were built, to a minor extent also health centers and schools. And as it is common for these types of programs, the physical upgrades were bundled with a verbal guarantee where the government officials promised to the residents that they would not be evicted for at least another 15 years. And it's common to have these kinds of unofficial guarantees, because part of the objective of slum upgrading programs is that you want the residents to start privately investing as well in the neighborhood, and they would not do it if they think that their tenure is very insecure. So just to put this in context, you have to think of a country that was resource constrained. There were very dense slums, and the government wanted to do something right away to improve the living conditions of the residents. And slum upgrading has this advantage that for a relatively low cost, you can provide benefits to residents at scale. And in fact, for KIP, for this particular program, these benefits were documented by a 1995 World Bank evaluation report that finds that upgraded kampungs in Jakarta experienced improvements in neighborhood quality. The residents were more educated, were healthier, and so on. Now, one concern that policymakers have is that with these programs, you are going to end up making the slums persist longer, because in fact, inherent in these programs is the idea to preserve the slums. And in the long run, once formal land values start picking up, there is a concern that there might be opportunity costs associated with land use. You're deterring redevelopment by making slums more attractive, so you're preserving slums at the expense of formal developments that would yield higher land values. And you could potentially tax those higher land values. You could collect property tax and fund other redistributive policies if you wanted to. So for policymakers, there is really a need to evaluate these trade-offs. And so what do we need to inform these trade-offs? We need data on both formal and informal areas. We need a credible research design to overcome program selection bias. Slum upgrading programs target, by definition, places that are in poor conditions to begin with. So there is negative selection into the program. And then we need a context where we can see these potential opportunity costs starting to bite. So we need to observe a city once it actually starts formalizing. And this is the context that we have in Jakarta, a mega city that has relatively recently started growing out of informality. It has expanded tremendously since KIP times, and in around the year 2000 is when we start seeing the formal developments and the high rises in the city. So let me walk you over the data that we use. So we collected policy maps telling us where the program was implemented, and zooming in, we even know which assets were placed where as part of the program, like what roads were paved. These are the pink and yellow segments. And we needed a control group, though, to make comparisons that were meaningful. So we digitized historical maps telling us where the kampungs were in Jakarta before the program was implemented. And putting together all these data, we have our treatment and control group. We're going to compare treated slums against places that we know were slums in the 50s, but did not receive the program. We also have another strategy where we do a comparison right at the boundary of KIP areas within 200 meters, and our results are consistent with the two methods. Now, what are our primary outcomes? First, prices and quantities, land values and building heights. So for land values, we were fortunate to find this administrative database of land value assessments. So this is something that the land agency does for property tax purposes to determine how much you owe in property tax. And so each of these red polygons is a subzone, a small unit in the zoning system for which the land agency performed an assessment of what are land values based on market transactions. And the nice feature is that this data set has pretty comprehensive coverage. It also covers informal areas. And in fact, slum residents in Jakarta pay property tax, and they show the bill as an informal proof of ownership. So this is prices, land values, then quantities. We wanted to observe real estate quantities. So what we did is we turned to a representative survey of photographs, and from the photographs, we measure building heights. We just look at how tall buildings are. So we first drew a representative sample of 20,000 pixels, 75 meter by 75 meter grid cells. And then we first turned to Google Street View to obtain photos for each of these pixels. Now, Google Street View suffers from coverage bias because the Google Street car cannot enter the narrowest streets in kampungs and some of the gated and cannot enter in some of the gated communities. So to get a representative sample, which is really important here, we had to complement Google Street View with photos that our enumerators took on the field. And so from these photos, one of the outcomes we look at is whether there is a high rise in sight, a building with more than 3 floors. So with these two primary outcomes in hand, we turn to our comparison between treated slums and control slums. And the punchline is that on average, KIP slums, treated slums have 15% lower land values and half as many tall buildings. So if you see what from the photos, what has happened is basically that the KIP kampungs have stayed slums, and the non-KIP kampungs by now have formalized with higher land values and building heights. Now, can we quantify the extent to which KIP looks like this photo versus this other photo? So that opens up kind of a question in the literature on slums, which is measurement. How do we define slums? There isn't really a standard definition because there are multiple aspects that have to do with neighborhood quality, but also with the legal side of things, whether people have titles. So there isn't a standard definition. There are many dimensions to slums, and there is always this concern of lack of representative data. They're not necessarily covered by standard data sources. So remotely sensed imagery can help because of the comprehensive coverage. And it has been employed in the literature to map slums. But this approach can miss many of the attributes that are only visible from the ground. And in our context in particular, in Jakarta, you wouldn't really be able to tell which places are slums purely from aerial photographs or from the satellite, because the building's materials are very similar in formal and in informal areas. It's not like, say, Nairobi, where you can see the slums from the tin roofs. So remotely sensed imagery would not have worked for us. So we turned to ground imagery to capture the aspect of neighborhoods. And we also complement this with other proxies that capture the presence of registered land titles and land fragmentation. So let me start by showing you what we do with the photos. For a subset of the photos from the representative sample I told you before, we code two indexes of informality. One is rank-based. So what we did was we asked two research assistants from Jakarta to independently rank photos on a scale from 0 to 4, where 0 means very formal and 4 means very informal. And there is some degree in subjectivity in doing this, and that's why we average the assessment of the two arrays, or we can always throw in an array fixed effect. But the advantage is that you can come up with kind of a holistic assessment of what the neighborhood looks like. There are some things that are inherently hard to code, for example, how irregular the structures are, and that's something that you can capture with this kind of index. We also coded an attribute-based index, where we came up with a list of 15 attributes pertaining to vehicular access, the type of structures in slums, and the appearance of the neighborhood. And we code these attributes and we aggregate them into a z-score. And this is less subjective, but you can measure all possible attributes. Now, thankfully, the two approaches yield similar conclusions. The two indexes are correlated. And by the way, I should say we do this manually. We don't go down the machine learning path, because our sample is barely the size of a training sample. So the photos are actually quite complex, so we have to do it manually. Here you can see with our index, this is the rank-based index, the varying degrees of informality in a city like Jakarta, and how KIP, according to these indexes, KIP areas are more informal based on what these places look like. As another proxy for informality, we look at land titles. This is a pretty unique data set recently made available by the Indonesian Land Agency. These are digital maps with land parcels. And for each land parcel, we know what type of property right is in place, and in particular, whether it's a registered title or an unregistered title. So we compute the share of pixels that correspond to unregistered land parcels. And we find that, consistent with our prior result, we find that the share of unregistered titles is higher in KIP areas. So again, suggesting that KIP areas are more informal. Another feature we look at is land fragmentation. These are cadastral maps of land parcels in Jakarta, and the red boundaries are boundaries of KIP areas for one particular area. And you can see a pattern that is strikingly different in KIP areas versus non-KIP areas. KIP areas are more fragmented, and we compute several metrics. On average, they have 9 more parcels per pixel. And consistent with this greater parcel density, we also find greater population density in KIP from the census. And this greater land fragmentation can contribute towards making these places more difficult to redevelop, because it increases land assembly costs that developers face. They first have to assemble the land, and if you have a lot of claimants, that process is more complicated, fraught with holdout problems and the like. So what is the story? Just to take a step back, what have we found here? So what we think is going on is that initially the upgraded kampungs were better than the non-upgraded ones, but then over time, as the city started formalizing, there was a reversal, with the non-KIP kampungs becoming fancy neighborhoods with high rises, and the KIP kampungs lagging behind. Now, intuitively, this reversal is most likely to happen in places that have a greater real estate market potential, in like fancy areas in the center. So we look at heterogeneity in our results by real estate market potential, which we proxy by coming up, we compute basically a predicted formal land values index, and then we bin Jakarta into 5 quintiles. So in the 5th quintile, which is areas with the lowest real estate market potential, so think like the periphery, these are places where KIP kampungs are actually better than non-KIP kampungs. And this is consistent with the direct improvements for the program. They have 10% higher land values. But as you move towards areas that have greater potential for formalization, for redevelopment, this effect attenuates and eventually flips sign, culminating in a large negative difference between KIP and non-KIP in the center, in the high market potential areas, where KIP has 30% lower land values than non-KIP. Now, if you're a policymaker, you see this result, you could conclude, well, this means that it is clearly inefficient to preserve slums in the center. So we want to inform this question, is KIP inefficient or not, and if so, where? Now, if this were a setting with perfect land markets, if we saw KIP having lower land values, we would tend to conclude that it is inefficient. But actually, it's a little more complicated here because this is a setting with imperfect land markets and a setting where lower land values in KIP does not necessarily imply inefficiency. Why is that? Because non-KIP kampungs that got redeveloped are in many instances places where the residents were evicted upon formalization and were not compensated. And because developers do not necessarily internalize the loss of surplus of displaced slum residents, you can have instances where formalization is privately profitable, but not efficient from society's standpoint. So to answer the policymaker's question of where and when KIP might be inefficient, where and when preserving slums might be inefficient, we need to compare the gains from formalizing against the losses from displacing the slum residents. And the gains from formalizing come from the fact that formal areas have higher land values and taller buildings, but the slum residents that get displaced lose potentially a lot of surplus because the slums are very densely packed. They might have lower building heights, but the horizontal coverage of buildings is greater, so they can pack really a lot of people. So we do this exercise, I'll spare you the details, but essentially what we do is for each KIP neighborhood, we want to calculate surplus, consumer and producer surplus in KIP from our data on KIP prices and quantities, and compare it against the counterfactual producer and consumer surplus in a non-KIP counterfactual. And we use our treatment effect, we leverage our treatment effects to get at the non-KIP counterfactual prices and quantities. So we calculate this difference in surplus for neighborhoods in different degrees of real estate market potential. Again, the quintiles of the figure I showed you before. So this is the key object we're interested in, and positive values mean here that the KIP surplus is greater than the non-KIP surplus, so preserving slums might be efficient. Negative values means the opposite. And so the pattern that we see is one where at the very top of the market, because KIP has much lower land values, informal surplus is small relative to the potential formal surplus realized upon formalization. But this difference actually attenuates very quickly as we move towards lower market potential areas. So really, if you look at like the losses and surplus associated with KIP in this framework, they're really all very concentrated in the very top of the market. So quintiles 1 and 2, where you find 47% of KIP areas, and this is where 90% of the losses are concentrated. And conversely, in quintiles 3, 4, and 5, formalization doesn't yield major gains relative to the informal surplus lost. And quintiles 3, 4, and 5 are actually hosting a lot of people. It's 3 million KIP residents. So it's a large fraction of the city where it's not obvious that you want to formalize. And we also look at some case studies of specific instances of kampung redevelopments in Jakarta. And we apply the same framework. So one thing we find is that first there are some, these are just 3 examples, but the qualitative patterns we found in many other instances. So first we find that there are some redevelopments that happen that do not yield societal gains. Like Bukit Duri was a peripheral slum that was cleared, but our calculations suggest that it was not worth formalizing. The surplus destroyed was more than the formal surplus created. The second takeaway is that even in places where we see that formalization yields large societal gains, like for example, Kalijodo, which was a central area in Jakarta, these societal gains might not yield Pareto gains for the slum residents. When you look at what actually happened to the residents, in none of these cases, they actually got paid. In Kalijodo in particular, they were offered as a compensation subsidized apartments 24 kilometers away from their original location. Anecdotally, they didn't want to go there because it was too far away, and our calculations suggest a surplus loss of 54% associated with being displaced to this peripheral location. But if you look at other cases as well, you find that it's with the current land market institutions, it's really challenging to share the gains from formalization with the residents. And in particular, in this second row, Kalipes Sangrahan, this is an example of a slum where the residents actually had property titles. But despite that, the land sale negotiations have been stalling since 2015 because the parties can't agree on what is an appropriate compensation. So this is just to say that the frictions are beyond just providing individual property titles. So going back, and I'll conclude in just a minute, going back to our original question, which was what should we do with slums? And really more broadly, how should we provide shelter in developing country cities? This discussion suggests that slum upgrading does delay formalization, and this does entail opportunity costs, but it can also be viewed as a tool to provide affordable housing in a setting where there are a lot of constraints, a lot of resource constraints, and a weak institutional capacity. So if you're a country if you're a developing country city, you will have probably a massive housing backlog to face. In Jakarta, these are just some numbers for Indonesia and Jakarta. It is estimated that you'll need to build 70,000 additional housing units every year. And since the late 80s, only 14,000 have been built for public housing. So it's a lot of people that need shelter. It's very challenging to relocate them into public housing. Maybe keeping them in the slums in some sense, in a very third best world, is the best a government can do as a stopgap measure. So if we want to contrast slum upgrading with other examples of slum policies and more broadly policies to provide shelter, titling, sure, in the first best world, if we could give everyone titles and get the land markets to work seamlessly, that would be great. In practice, it's very hard to provide titling at scale. You need credible institutions. So if that's not an option, what can we do? Well, if we still have empty land available, we can do sites and services, and some recent research finds positive effects of that. But a city like Jakarta is out of land, so that's not an option anymore. So that leaves us with either public housing or slum upgrading. Public housing is very expensive. And so what we have provided here is hopefully a framework to quantify some of the opportunity costs of slum upgrading that governments can trade off against the costs of other ways of providing shelter and addressing slums like public housing. But our evidence is that these opportunity costs of land use manifest themselves only in certain areas and only when the city actually starts formalizing, which means that slum upgrading can be viewed as a potentially attractive policy option, especially for cities that are at early stages where formal land values really haven't picked up yet, and cities that are out of land to provide shelter in other ways, like with public housing or with sites and services. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to open it up for discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Amina. That was just fascinating. I mean, this paper is the most significant piece of work I've seen on understanding the economics of slums and transforming slums. And I know it's going to have a big impact both on academic research and on urban policy in the developing country settings. So I'm going to start the discussion by asking you a couple of questions about trying to understand your work, both in terms of how land markets and emerging economies operate, and then how we translate that understanding to policy. I'm going to be closely monitoring the chat. So if folks would like to ask questions, please throw those in the chat, and I'll weave them in. So to start, one thing that comes out of your work is just a recognition of the massive distortions that exist in the land markets that you're studying. And we have the big distortion of the absence of land titles. We have a second distortion that even if you have land titles, their coordination costs in terms of bringing folks together to sell land at a large enough scale to be of interest to developers. And then we have a third distortion in that there is asymmetric information about land values. And when you put these three things together, what we get is no action unless developers have enough political leverage to get folks evicted. So in light of that, and in light of kind of the recognizing kind of your skepticism about doing the full-on land titling transformation of slums at scale, if I look at your work, I would then see kind of the following strategy emerging. And that is, you want to use, we can use this great new methodology that you've developed to understand heterogeneity in the value of formalizing parcels. And then you kind of begin by focusing on land titling and addressing coordination issues and providing information about market values there. As you suggest, it might be a pretty small fraction of the total, and that might get you around the scale issue. The problem with choosing some areas over other areas is that it gets political very quickly. And so, there might be blocking coalitions that prevent that from coming about. So I'd just like to kind of hear your thoughts about how what the translating these results into policy action based on an appreciation of the way these three big distortions interact.
Yes, that's a great question. So land markets so first let me start by saying that the distortions in land markets, as you said, it's beyond just providing individual titles. There is actually a process in the law to convert your customary land title in a formal one. And people know how to do it. It's just very costly to do it. And then, as you mentioned, it's not enough that one person does it, because you need to assemble land. Land assembly is crucial. Even in developed countries, we have evidence that land assembly frictions are important, and they are a really crucial component of developers' risk. And these kinds of frictions are just magnified here. So and the case studies that I've talked about also speak to this idea that it's not just about having titles. You need coordinating institutions, and the government and middlemen have always mediated Kampung redevelopment. So in the instances where we do see Kampung land being redeveloped, there is usually a role for the government officials to step in and coordinate. And you were saying maybe what these results are saying is, well, you cannot do titling at scale, but start with these areas in the center, right, where the gains from formalization are higher. One other thing I want to mention is that a prerequisite to do titling and to solve some of the coordination problems is also mapping. So figuring out what's on the ground, who has informal claims, what the boundaries of the parcels are. And this is where efforts like this effort by the Indonesian government can potentially pay off. And this is also where recent advances in remote sensing have helped. So this data set is really unique, and it comes from LiDAR surveying of Jakarta. Once we started working with this data set, we realized that actually it had a lot of internal inconsistencies, and it's not that surprising, because to put together something like this, you need to combine the surveying from aerial imagery or remotely sensed sources. You have to combine this with the land records that exist. So even in informal areas, and that's actually another interesting point to make, that it's not like in informal areas there is no market for land. Informal markets are very lively, and properties get transacted. The informal claims get transacted all the time, and the deeds are even registered in the local kelurahan offices. Kelurahans are the small local administrative units. But if you want to produce like mappings like this, a major challenge is reconciling these different sources. And as we were kind of working our way through these land maps, we really got to appreciate how complicated the process is once you try to practically implement it, to reconcile satellite imagery with the deeds data, with the local records. And there are still a lot of inconsistencies in this data set that the government is, that the land agency is patiently working on reconciling. So this just speaks to the practical challenges in doing these kinds of mapping efforts. But I think now that we have more of these data sources that allow us at least to see the outlines of parcels from the satellite or from aerial photographs, this will help towards like this first step, which is producing mappings. It's not going to be the silver bullet, is like just one first step, because then you have to resolve ownership disputes, and then you have to promote the creation of coordinating institutions to make it easier to assemble land in places that look like this. So I think there are many steps, but mapping will help. The other thing that will help is I think having more of these where is it here? More of these market-based assessment of land values. So this was a fairly recent effort by the Jakarta government. This is from 2015. To leverage lots of different data sources, listings, transactions, prices, to come up with more credible land value assessments. And so I think continuing with these kinds of efforts will help ease the land market transactions, and including in areas where titles are in place, but the parties can't really converge on what the actual market value is.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of the questions on in that domain, but before we get to those, I think Amit Patel has a question.
Hi, this is Amit Patel from University of Massachusetts, Boston, Assistant Professor in Public Policy. Professor Harari, this was a fascinating presentation and in research, and as someone who has done work in slums, I can see like how the data challenges are a big question, and such a robust approach that you have taken here to source from multiple different novel ways of collecting data to have this conclusive kind of answer to the question you have. I just wanted to dwell a little bit more on the question that you raised towards the end, that there is certainly a clear indication that slum upgrading does slow down the formalization and land values. But I wanted to take an evolutionary view of this. What is in Q3, Q4, and Q5 today is going to be tomorrow's Q1 and Q2, where it becomes marketable. And so what we can then conclude is that Q1, Q2 today, the Kampungs in Q1, Q2 today, were Q3 and Q4 and Q5 of yesterday, because slums are at desirable locations, but for the slum residents' point of view, but these are the land parcels where no one wanted to go at the time, so they're allowed to stay, and then they consolidate. So I'm taking this evolutionary view, and then since they are consolidated, they're also the beneficiary of improvement programs, which is also a privilege, and those who can demand develop will get that. So my question to you is like, so at the end, what do we tell these policymakers? So upgrade now, and then eventually we want to formalize here, so they should move somewhere else and then wait there for upgrading later. I'm trying to understand it in more temporal sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so great point. So we view like this heterogeneity is telling us something about what we think the evolution over time of this was, right? So this is what Jakarta was at the time of KIP. This is where the center is, and eventually, right, the Q3 will become Q1, as you say. So from the policymaker standpoint, I think it's about like, what do you want to do now to buy you some time, right? Because given the timeline that we've seen in Jakarta, it took many decades for the center to become what it is now, Q1. So the program was implemented in the starting in the late 60s. The first high rises in Jakarta, we've seen them in the early 2000s. So it took many decades to get there. So I guess, so it is true that you want to be forward looking, right? And as you think about, where to implement slum upgrading, where to promote redevelopment, you want to keep an eye towards what the future path of land values will be. But for a lot of governments, slum upgrading is really more of a stopgap policy. Like a way to improve the living conditions of residents now while you buy yourself some time. So it might still be the case that slum upgrading is the appropriate policy option for, say, second-tier cities. It's true that they will become like Jakarta maybe in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, we don't know exactly when, but it is a way to kind of buy yourself time. And then in the interim, maybe you can implement complementary policies to improve the workings of the land market. So you could do slum upgrading now, but in the interim also work on providing titles, for example. And that way you know that there will be potentially opportunity costs in the future, but you kind of lay the groundwork to make them as small as possible in the future.
Great, thank you. Your answer to that question answered another question in chat, which was, what are the next steps after slum upgrading for the early stage process? There's one more question here in the chat from Celia Eckert. Could we unmute Celia to ask the question directly?
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I've learned a lot in such a short amount of time. So I have a sort of two-part question, which I hope is brief, but I would like to hear a little bit more about how you quantify the social costs of displacement, if I understood that correctly, in order to quantify this question of the efficiency of slum rehabilitation in Jakarta. And the second part of my question is maybe perhaps naive, but I come more from political philosophy. So I was wondering whether the quantification of the efficiency of a policy like this relies on a priori evaluations about the relative value of different governing goals, like good housing, increasing land value, et cetera. And I would just like to hear more about your process in quantifying these different governing goals. Thank you.
Sure, great points. So this calculation, the way in which we implement this calculation is we calculate the sum of consumer and producer surplus in a housing market equilibrium for KIP, where we assume the equilibrium prices are the KIP prices and quantity. The equilibrium prices and quantities are the ones we observe in the data. So it's consumer and producer surplus in KIP against the non-KIP counterfactual. So we start from a comparison just in the real estate value, the value of the built up stock, so prices times quantities. But we think as economists that we care about utility, not about the value of the built up stock, although this could be an interesting object of interest, but we want to do it in surplus terms. So to convert value into surplus, technically what we do is we introduce some assumptions for the shape of the demand and the supply curve, and we introduce estimates of the relevant elasticities from the literature. So we use different elasticities for the formal and the informal consumers and producers, and one implication of that is that the value of the informal stock gets weighted relatively more than the formal one here, because we assume that the informals are more inelastic. That said, you can play around with different elasticities for robustness that will give you a different relative weighing of the informal versus the formal surplus. We found that really the qualitative pattern, that there is probably an efficiency at the center, but not in the other quintiles, that qualitatively remains the same. Now, that said, this is a calculation of total societal efficiency. And then what we think this is an input that policymakers will use, making their own trade-offs against equity considerations and against what the other policy options are that they can choose from. And so this is the equity part is something that I was hinting at here. Like, you have instances where there are societal gains from formalizing, but in practice, if we don't think there's a way to share these gains with the residents on purely equity considerations, as a policymaker, you could decide that you don't want to formalize because on equity grounds, you think it is justifiable to preserve a slum here. So really, this is a back of the envelope calculation that speaks to the societal efficiency, and then it is up to the policymaker to weigh this against equity considerations, their redistributive goals, and then really it's about contrasting slum upgrading with the other range of policies that are available to them. So if in practice for you, it boils down to either slum upgrading or public housing, right? You don't have a whole range of options, it's either one or the other, these calculations help you inform what the costs are, and then you could decide that you are willing to take these costs because to you, like the equity implications are more important, and then that's up to the government to do. Like our exercise is just to quantify, and there's really no quantification of these gains and losses. So we think it's a useful input in the policymakers' decision-making process.
Nina, thank you for this great presentation and the great discussion. There's so much to unpack here, and I know that you've been in close consultation with folks in the policy world about your results, trying to help improve the design of efforts to help those living in slums improve their livelihoods, for the society as a whole to advance, and avoiding the sort of expropriation that leads to just real disastrous outcomes for folks who are dislodged from long-time informal settlements. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and I will turn things over to Nika to close us off.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina Harari and Professor Hanson. I think I can speak for everybody in this room when I say it was a deeply engaging and interesting conversation and presentation. And before we let everybody go, I just want to remind you that this is the last speaker series for the fall. We hope to see many repeat attendees in the spring when we start up the series again. Please follow us via our social media channels and by subscribing to our newsletter. Thank you, everybody.